So the first thing that we found that you shouldn't do is improve teaching first. This was a really common mistake. Lots of schools thought that the answer was just to put in great teachers. We found that that actually was not a good use of resources. It didn't make sense to put good teachers into a school that had poor governance, poor leadership, operated across a lot of different sites, and had poor behaving students, because they couldn't have the impact that they should have. So we believe that you should put those things in place first. You need to create the right environment for your teachers. You can't expect them to do everything or sort everything out by themselves. The second thing which we found that you shouldn't do, that is a commonly held view, is reduce class sizes. Again, we found that had minimal impact and wasn't a good use of resources. Much more important is that you improve student behavior and motivation. Now, this is probably one of the more controversial findings. We found the fastest way to do that, which a lot of the academies do, is to significantly reduce the number of students you teach by excluding them, excluding poor behaving students. In some instances, we found they actually pay other schools to teach those students for them. Or, which is quite common practice, is you build a new school that's a lot smaller than the existing school so that you have the opportunity to change your student profile. So those are the practices we saw, very common, and that was the fastest way to change your student profile. But I think we would all argue, not the right solution for society in the long term. Better practice that we saw, a better long-term practice, was to create multiple pathways within the school and to take the poor behaving students and move them into another pathway so they could be managed differently and then reintegrated once their behavior improved. Part of the challenge for the school is that the targets and measures that are set by Ofsted means they often don't have the time to make the right long-term solutions because they're up against a very short-term pressure. The third thing is don't use a zero-tolerance behaviour policy and come down on poor behaviour. We found that although it has a good short-term impact, the impact starts to fade. And in some cases, we found students rioted or even revolted. Much better practice is to create an all-through school, right from the age of 5 all the way up to 16 or 18, so that you can create the right culture early on. You can start to instill good behavior in the students, and you can make sure that the bad behavior doesn't start to emerge. It also, if you're teaching at secondary school level, it means that you aren't now taking in a very diverse mix of students, different backgrounds, different behaviors, different views of what good is and how they should be. So it made teaching at a secondary school level much easier. The fourth thing we found that you shouldn't do is use a superhead. We found that in all the cases where this was used, they didn't create the right conditions for long-term sustainable improvement. They came in, they were there for 12 to 18 months. They focused all of the attention, resources, teaching capability on year 11 that was being assessed. And they just focused on maths and English. They made a change. They created a short-term impact. They took credit for that change, and then they moved on. The teams that then came in afterwards found that performance dipped after they went because they diverted attention away from the other years and the other subjects. Of course, the Superheads claimed that performance had dipped because they were no longer there, but it was actually that they diverted attention and resources and capability from the other parts of the school. And in some cases, it took as long as 3 years to then start to return around that school because of the damage that had been created. If that team had come in on day one, they could have started to put the right things in place right from the beginning. So you need to improve all year groups. It's also very important that you look at all the subjects, not just maths and English. The next common belief that we found wasn't true was that inner city schools are more difficult to turn around. We actually found they're much easier to turn around. And they're much easier because you have greater access to good leadership, both at governance and head level, great teachers, and great students. You're in a much bigger pool, and you've got much greater access. You actually need to invest more resources in the rural and coastal schools, because it's much more difficult to attract those good leaders, teachers, and students there. You have to work a lot harder to do that. Now, again, we found, a lot of times people came from inner city schools, went to rural and coastal schools, thought they could do exactly what they've done in the inner city school, and it didn't work. And it took, in many cases, up to 2 years for them to realize you have to pay much higher salaries to attract good teachers in those areas. So they'd lost 2 years in terms of turning the school around and starting to have a positive impact. The final thing which we found, which is a common belief, is that more resources do not speed up improvement. This is not about throwing resources at the school to try and speed things up. What's much more important is you make the right changes in the right order. And actually, if you make the right changes in the right order, you can create some of the resources you need early on and then invest them afterwards. However, you do need to plan for a dip in financial performance. Now, I know people who work in schools don't like to use the word profit, but you need to recognize that if you are going to exclude some of your poor behaving students, your revenue will dip, and your costs are going to go up if you want to attract good teachers. And also what we found was very important as you're, it's probably about a year into your journey, is employing middle managers to manage parents. That means that teachers can spend more time teaching, which is what they're there to do, and heads can spend more time leading, which is what they're there to do. So you've got the combination of revenue dipping and costs going up before exam results will start to improve. Now again, we found a number of instances where the schools were pursuing financial performance, and then only 2 or 3 years in that they realized they were going to have to accept financial performance must dip before exam results improved. So those are our key findings. But if I was to leave you with 3 points from today, what would they be? The first one is you have to create the right environment before you improve teaching. It's absolutely critical. You can't expect your teachers to sort everything out. They're there to teach. They're not there to sort out the other problems within the school. So you've got to create the right governance, facilities, and in particular the right student behavior so they can have the maximum impact. Secondly, the most significant impact occurred when schools changed their students. By excluding poor behaving students, creating multiple pathways within their school so they could start to manage different behavior in different ways, or creating an all-through school. which actually, in the long term, is a much more positive and long-term sustainable solution. And thirdly, you need to realize you're going to have a dip in financial performance if you want exam results to improve. That's got to happen. So you need to either be part of a larger group, so you can start to share resources within the group, or another practice we observed that was very good and had lots of benefits was to acquire another school early on, whether that's a secondary school or a primary school, because that increased your revenue early on in your journey and enabled you to spread your costs across a much larger number of students.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. It's interesting seeing the do's and the don'ts, because we've been through a similar sort of journey, and I agree about the idea of decent student behaviour and motivation. And I know there's no magic wand, but from the experience of your investigation, what worked best with improving student motivation and behaviour?
Well, this again is part of the challenge, part of, I think, a bit of an issue personally about Ofsted. I mean, the advantage I have is I don't work in education. So I'm looking at this from performance, and I'm less emotionally connected to the topic, which I personally see as a good thing. The fastest way to do it is to exclude poor behaviour. That's the fastest way. Do I think that's the right way for society in the long term? No, of course it isn't. But that is the fastest way. The best way in the long term, as we said, to create the all-through school, so you can start to get the right behaviour in place very early on. Now, what we found, this is a big difference of inner city and, we called them inner city, urban, rural and coastal. A big difference between the inner city and the urban and the rural, in particular the coastal. In the coastal, if you exclude half your students, or you build a new school that's half the size of the old one, so you have to change your profile, you don't have then students, other good students to attract straight away. So it takes a while to then build your students back up. If you do it in a city school, we found that you could start to attract good students much faster. Now, I know these schools aren't meant to be selective, but what we have found is that the profile of the students in those schools changes significantly. For example, the ethnicity changes dramatically, and also where they live, whether they live within a mile or outside of a mile from the school, which you could argue is that they're more motivated because they're trying to travel there to that school. So it's not, I don't think it's the right long-term solution for society, but there's an argument here about, do you create a high-performing organisation that then attracts good students, that then educates them in the future, or do you focus on the student and say what's right for the student? And it's going to be a mix of both.